Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Prisoners escaped from prisons in Maputo, Mozambique on Christmas Day. Police officers were seen participating in looting with protesters in Mozambique. And now the South African Minister of International Relations has issued a statement about the crisis in Mozambique. Let's talk about this crisis in Mozambique. Let's talk about what South Africa can do about the crisis in Mozambique and what to expect going forward. But before we dive into that, there's something that I want to point out, something that I want to bring up, a point in limine, if you will. We hear too much about what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in the United States of America with Donald Trump, with Kamala Harris, Putin, Zelensky, Boris Johnson, all of these characters. We hear a lot about what is happening in Africa, but we don't hear enough about what is happening regionally in Africa from African media houses. Think about it. We have more perspectives on China, Russia, United Kingdom, America, the EU than we have on Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and on Egypt. Think about this peculiarity of the news ecosystem in South Africa and in Africa. We hear about all of these things happening around the world, about AI, Sam Altman, Elon Musk, all of these characters. We're not hearing about what is happening in Sudan, about what is happening in Cameroon, what is happening in Congo, what is happening in Ethiopia. And Sudan has had the largest conflict in Africa for the last 2 years. Shouldn't we be hearing daily about what is happening in Sudan? Shouldn't we be hearing daily about what is happening in Mozambique on mainstream news, on every channel? Mozambique is right next to South Africa. If there's a problem in Mozambique, it will affect South Africa. Sometimes an American issue will trend more in South African Twitter, in African Twitter, than an issue that is happening in Mozambique. Right now, Mozambique is burning, and we haven't heard round-the-clock coverage about this issue in South Africa. There are protests in Mozambique, protests which have led to border closures in South Africa with the Libombo border, right? Mozambique has had reports of terror groups in the northern part, in the Del Cabo region, terror groups who could end up causing havoc all across SADC, all across Africa. But we don't hear enough about it. Mozambique and everything that is happening right now is big enough of an issue that it should be getting rolling coverage on all of the media houses, but it's not. And that's a problem. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's happening in Mozambique currently. In case you're not following, there were elections in Mozambique on the 9th of October. Those elections were disputed. The results were initially reported by the Electoral Commission as being 71% for Frelimo and their presidential candidate, Daniel Chapo, and 20% for Venancio Mondlane and his party, Podemo, which is now the largest opposition. These elections were disputed and contested for a variety of issues, which I'll talk about later. And there were protests after the elections due to multiple issues. These protests have been going on for 2 months, October, November, December. And they've led to border closures. They've led to internet shutdowns. Over 150 people have been killed in Mozambique by the police and the military since those elections happened on the 9th of October. Significantly, even opposition leaders were assassinated. So, for instance, Elviano Diaz, who was an advisor to the Podemo presidential candidate, Venancio Mondlane, was killed alongside another party official, Paulo Gaumbe, earlier this year. Think about that. A lawyer who's an advisor to the presidential candidate being killed. Within the South African context, that's like Donald Trump, not Donald Trump, what do I say? It's like Advocate Dalimpo for being killed. Why was I thinking about Donald Trump? I was thinking about whoever are his lawyers. Imagine if one of his lawyers got assassinated in America during the election. There would be outcry. It would be a travesty. It would be something gravely significant. And it's not insignificant because it happened in Mozambique with their election. It's still significant. It just hasn't been covered by the media as extensively as it should be, and the extent of the crisis has not been underlined as it should be. This was not the first assassination of significant proportions. Assassinations happen in Mozambique frequently, but I want to give you another example. In 2019, an election observer named Anastasio Matavel was shot dead by the police. And we know that it was the police. What happened was 5 armed men with assault rifles shot him 10 times, and they fled in a car from the scene of the crime after they'd killed this guy. But they crashed the car. And that's how we know that it was the police that killed him. 6 other people were found guilty of murdering him as well. It was a coordinated effort, and they were arrested. Right, that happened in 2019. Every election in Mozambique comes with these types of issues. So now think about it. Elviano Diaz assassinated. Venancio Mondlane assassinated. 2019, there were assassinations, and we know it was the police that did it. These are grave irregularities. So this happened in this election, the assassination of Elviano Diaz. On Monday, the Constitutional Council, which is the highest electoral court body, ratified the election outcome, which was contested. But they revised the results downwards for some of the parties. So Frelimo was moved from 71% to 65%. Podemo was moved from 20% to 24%. After the announcement by the Constitutional Council, protests broke out even more. More people broke out onto the streets. The protests got more aggressive, more violence. And this is what has led to what we've seen: prisoners escaping, police participating in looting, etc., etc. There's a frustration in Mozambique because Frelimo has been running the country for 49 years, since 1975. And people are of the view that they have been illegitimately in government for the last few administrations. There's frustration and the feeling that if they don't do something now, Frelimo will just continue to run the country. There's massive poverty in Mozambique, massive levels of youth unemployment. Many people are working within the informal economy. Very few people are in the formal economy altogether. And Mozambique is a rich nation, vast mineral resources, large country, massive tourist opportunities, but it's underdeveloped and people are frustrated, right? So, first thing I want to respond to here, or I want to address, was the election in Mozambique rigged? Yes, it was. It was rigged. There have consistently been rigging of election in Mozambique. The observer who was killed in 2019, I just told you about, had exposed stuffing of ballots in his particular region. Right now, if you think about what the the Constitutional Council said, they found basically 6% worth of fraud in the announced results from what Frelimo got. Remember, Frelimo was announced by the Electoral Commission to be at 71. These guys say, no, 71 is too much. Give them 65. The fact that you have 6% fraud in an election that you can prove, to me, shows that the election in and of itself is illegitimate. There's no way that you can say that you've uncovered that level of fraud, because it's systemic. There are systemic things which were being done, and some of those things have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, to the point where even the Constitutional Commission Council is saying, no, we got to bring those numbers down. What would a full expose with a full investigation expose? 6% that you already acknowledge and concede to. By the way, there are multiple entities that have complained about this election, but this election, if you ask me, it was rigged. There was video footage showing that people were bussed from Zimbabwe to vote. It was captured on video. Zimbabweans were voting in Mozambique, not dual citizens or anything like that, because there are dual citizens between South Africa and Mozambique and Zimbabwe, etc., etc. These were just people who were bussed in to vote. And there were the parties such as the ZANU-PF were involved in this particular election, helping Frelimo. Whenever you see entities like this, which have got multiple allegations against them of, electoral rigging, etc., etc., prima facie, it's evidence of electoral fraud. But that's not it. That's not the only thing. Election observers outlined irregularities in the elections. EU observers, Catholic Church observers, in the election counting, as well as pre-election and on election day. Multiple irregularities. were observed. Were these elections free and fair? No. There were violations of the African Charter for Democracy, Elections and Governance. And if you've never heard about this charter, it's an international treaty which has been ratified and is law in Mozambique. It is international law. Violated. There were violations on the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. People's political and human rights were violated in the process of this election and post the election. Illegitimate. That also is international law binding on Mozambique. Mozambique violated those laws. There is widespread electoral corruption in Mozambique and widespread corruption within Frelimo in and of themselves. I do not put it past them. You know, right now, the outgoing president of Frelimo and the country was exposed to have been money laundering, buying properties all across South Africa. Right? It's a massive scandal that was reported on. Just go check it out. It's been reported on. I can't remember the name of the papers right now, top of my head. But if you were to ask me, are elections in Mozambique free and fair? Nah, they're not. I cannot come here and say to you that these elections are free and fair. South Africa has now given a response. The Department of International Relations has issued a response, and it reads as follows. Following the proclamation of final results by the Constitutional Council of Mozambique, South Africa has noted with concern the ongoing violence and the subsequent disruptive protest in reaction to the announcement. South Africa calls on all parties to commit to an urgent dialogue that will heal the country and set it on a new political and developmental trajectory. Furthermore, South Africa is ready to assist Mozambique in any manner to facilitate this dialogue. The South African government will continue working with SADC and other multilateral agencies in supporting a lasting solution to the current impasse. South Africa calls on all parties to exercise restraint and calm. Some comments on this issue and just the general issue. The statement from the South African government and the Department of International Relations, I don't think it's enough. And I think that South Africa could play a bigger role in this issue. Why do I say this? Calling for calm when someone has been aggrieved and had their rights violated and maybe been unfairly treated, it often means that you are preserving the status quo because you're basically telling the protesters to stop protesting and to accept the results. Because if they are calm, they lose leverage. They lose the very thing that is making the world pay attention. And sooner or later, the momentum is lost and the incumbents remain in power. That is what calling for calm does in this particular situation. Also, calling for calm and just saying, no, we're going to work with everybody to see what we can do. I think it ignores some grave issues that have occurred in this particular election in Mozambique. Opposition leaders were killed during this election. They were killed. Also, why do I think the statement is not enough from South Africa? Because South Africa is going to be affected by this crisis. The Limbombo border was closed multiple times to prevent the mass exodus of people from Mozambique who were fleeing this particular protest, the crisis, the violence, the killings, right? Because they would be able to apply for refugee status at the border. Those borders were closed. There's a recognition. It affects trade that goes through that Limbombo border. Is it Libombo or I don't know how to pronounce that border name, right? Libombo, I think. Is that how you say it? So that's something that we have to be aware of. And the second largest immigrant nationality in South Africa, according to Stats South Africa, is actually people from Mozambique, Mozambicans. So a lot of them left Mozambique during the Civil War because Mozambique had a civil war for 16 years, from 1975 to 1992. So there are some people who were already living in South Africa pre-1992, but even after 1994, there are people from Mozambique who kept coming into South Africa because of instability in Mozambique and political violence in Mozambique. So if right now we're at a point where we're seeing a repeat of escalations in conflict, degradations, instability in Mozambique, that is something that is going to affect South Africa in the same way that the collapse of the Zimbabwe regime when there was a lost election by ZANU-PF and it was upheld by the regional body actors, led to a mass exodus of people from Zimbabwe in 2002. Between 2002 up until 2011, we saw a mass movement of people from Zimbabwe to South Africa as a result of the Mugabe regime failing, oppressing people, repressing rights, all while the economy was in free fall. Those things have a bearing on a neighboring country. So it's not enough just to say, no, everyone must remain calm. We'll see what we can do. The thing is, South Africa can do more as well because the ANC has a relationship with Frelimo. We just saw the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula hosting the Frelimo leaders, hosting Daniel Chapo. Of course, he supports them. He was very happy to have them around, etc., etc. But the point fundamentally is that action can be taken when you have a relationship. And perhaps there's need to have a discussion about a government or a coalition government power sharing deal of some sort, which South Africa also has lots of experience discussing. Right. So that's my view. I also want to make this point that I want you to consider. SADC, as a regional bloc, has been having low growth. And part of the reason why SADC has been having low growth is because of Mozambique and Zimbabwe. When you have two economies with massive corruption, illiberal governments, poor leadership, that slows down growth in the region. America is prosperous, right? North America, because of the strength of Canada and even Mexico. And this allowed them to create trade blocs, such as the North Atlantic Free Trade Treaty. If you look at the EU, the strength of the EU is also as a result of the strength of the cumulative membership. When you have neighboring countries which have high unemployment, high poverty, strife, all kinds of disruption, that limits how much you can trade with them, your exports, the value of what you can export, and it depresses the economic and activity in the region, the productivity of the region. Part of the reason why South Africa cannot become a manufacturing giant is because the importers in the region are going through turmoil. This is something that we have to be aware of. The instability in Mozambique, Eswatini, as well as in Zimbabwe has economic consequences on the health of the region as a whole. I don't know what you think, but that's my view on that particular issue. The other thing I want to say is that this crisis once again exposes the weakness of regional bodies. SADC, African Union, they failed to hold countries accountable, and other nation states have failed to hold each other accountable because they are populated by these former liberation movements. SWAPO in Namibia, BDP in Botswana, which recently fell, but was a reality for a long time, the African National Congress in South Africa, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, and Frelimo in Mozambique. These guys are in cahoots. Whenever one of them does something wrong, the other one will just rubber stamp, boom, 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 boom. That undermines the interests of the region, the interests of the people. And oftentimes they'll just say, no, sovereignty, sovereignty, sovereignty. But the sovereignty is not the sovereignty of a dictator. It's the sovereignty of the people. Those who govern with the consent of the people. So if those who are governed withdraw that consent or show that there are grounds for you to doubt the credibility of the person claiming to be their representative leader, the international community should not side with the dictator. They should side with the people on the ground whose sovereignty is now being hijacked by that particular authoritarian regime or corrupt political party. We can't just say sovereignty to prevent scrutiny of bad actions by political parties within the SADC region. But these former liberation movements continue to rubber stamp each other. How is that going to actually lead to progression? Particularly countries that say that they stand for values of human rights, values of democracy, dignity, equality, freedom. How can you say I stand for human rights and then you see somebody abusing someone next door and you keep quiet? You're supposed to bell the police or something or take action. One of the biggest tragedies that was being discussed, not the biggest tragedy, but a curious case. Somebody burned somebody on the New York's subway to death. And instead of intervening, people watched. And there was a conversation about why did people watch? Why did they not stop the burning of the person, etc.? It's like that song by Phil Collins, right? Where you begin to think, why don't you jump in and save the person from drowning if you can swim? There's a moral standard that I think exists in society. If you can help and you see someone being wronged, abused, victimized, brutalized, It's your obligation to do so. South Africa has already taken a stand on Morocco. South Africa has taken a stand on Ukraine. South Africa has taken a stand on Israel and gone to the International Court of Justice saying that Israel is violating human rights of children, women, and civilians in Gaza. Why does the government not extend the same energy to Mozambique, to Sudan? Right now, people are being killed in Mozambique. 150 people have been killed by the police, the army, women, children. Their lives have been destroyed. Can we say as Africans that we care more about George Floyd, about Zelensky, about Israel than we care about Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Sudan and Cameroon? And if we do say that, what does that say about us and how we see our own skin and the value of our own lives? You know, Malcolm X used to say the most disrespected person in America is a black woman. And what he was trying to do was to provoke his community to take better care of black women. But the most disrespected person on the earth is a black life. From slavery to colonialism to apartheid, all of these were denigrations of the value of black life. And we now have black leaders in all of these different African countries continuing the destruction of black lives, black development, black potential. Isn't it our obligation as people who are black in Africa to speak loudest about oppression and repression in Africa? What do you think? I don't know. I think it is. You know, these regional bodies, for me, have failed so many times. I don't know if you remember the example of the SADC tribunal. The SADC tribunal was established to adjudicate disputes involving member states, individuals, and organizations within SADC. Then there was a case in 2005, the Mike Campbell versus Republic of Zimbabwe case, where these guys took the government of Zimbabwe to the tribunal for illegal possession of their land. And the government of Zimbabwe lost the case. And then Zimbabwe withdrew from the tribunal in 2009. And then after that, in 2010, the SADC summit, the next SADC summit, decided to suspend the whole tribunal. They placed a moratorium on new cases. They prevented the appointment of the judges. The tribunal's functions were effectively paralyzed. And it was gone. In 2012, the SADC summit resolved to limit the tribunal's jurisdiction to only disputes between member states and not necessarily individuals and companies. Now there's no real tribunal. There's nothing going on with that tribunal. Now, the decisions to dissolve the tribunal were even rebutted and refuted by courts. The South African court, the Tanzanian courts, they ruled that the decisions to basically dissolve the tribunal were wrong and unlawful. But there's no more SADC tribunal. That's an example of a failure of SADC, these so-called African leaders misleading us. Another example, in 2002, a judicial observer mission was appointed by Thabo Mbeki to observe the elections in Zimbabwe. This judicial commission, which was wrote a report which was compiled by judges Sisi Kampepe and Judge Dikang Museneke, who were High Court judges at the time. They ended up being judges, and one of them, the Constitutional Court Chief Justice, or the judges of the Constitutional Court, one of them became the Constitutional Court Chief Justice. They wrote a report that said the elections were not free and they were not fair in Zimbabwe. That report was sealed, and the Mbeki administration endorsed the 2002 Zimbabwean elections, even though there was an observer mission report that said the elections were not free and fair. And that action gave legitimacy to Robert Mugabe and extended his regime for 15 more years. Because Robert Mugabe only left power in 2017. From 2002 to even in 2008, he lost the election. And then there was all of this meddling, and eventually there was a government of national unity, which Morgan Tsvangirai left a year later because he said this thing is not working. It extended Mugabe's regime again. Same thing was rubber stamped by African nations. They knew that the election was not legitimate. And the Kampepe report, it took people and media houses going to court for years. It was buried for years. I think it only came out in 2012. After a decade of people going up and down to courts trying to get that report. The different presidents, Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, Jacob Zuma, spent years fighting against the report of the release of that report. Think about it. Isn't that a failure? Isn't that a failure of regional bodies and countries to hold to account a neighboring nation, which I think they had room to do? South Africa didn't have to rubber stamp that election. Robert Mugabe could have fallen in 2002. He could have. Another example, in 2019, there was an election in Malawi. The election was full of irregularities. It got so bad because the people were even putting Tipex on the election results that were being published on the door of the voting station. It was called the Tipex election. That's how bad it was. The observer missions say this election is not free and fair. EU, all of the different observer missions. Guess who said the election was free and fair? SADC, African Union. That issue was taken to the courts by the opposition parties. And the Malawian Constitutional Court actually said there is an overwhelming amount of evidence. They called for a new election, a redo. And that election was redone in 2020. So the point that I'm trying to put across to you is that there have been multiple moments when the institutional bodies have failed. What must be done in Mozambique? Because things are getting out of hand. I think that, to be quite honest, no nation should endorse this election. It should not be endorsed. The African Union and SADC should not endorse this election. I think no SADC president should attend. And rather, what should be called for is for fresh elections in Mozambique. The stakes are too high. The stakes are too high. Will that happen? I don't think so. So what is the other alternative? That there be some kind of a power sharing agreement, a government, a transitional government, not a national unity government. I actually hate the idea of government of national unity, but a transitional government where some of the power, maybe what you do is you give vice president to Mondlane and some cabinet positions to Mondlane and some kind of a veto on issues of military, issues of finance. Because sometimes when there was a government of national unity in Zimbabwe 2008, what Mugabe did is he kept all the nice ministries and merged some of them and gave ZANU-PF hollow ministries where they had very little power. But if you make sure that finance, defense, policing are split between the parties and there's some kind of a veto power, maybe that will lead to something. But there's a need for a new electoral commission altogether in Mozambique, an independent one, because I think what has been happening historically is that they've been keeping representatives from Frelimo, from Renamo, etc., and that hasn't necessarily helped. And they were doing that partly because of the civil war. But the Electoral Commission is so compromised as things stand right now that something has to be done. There's a legitimate crisis. And people often say, well, the people on the ground must do something before the international community can act. I think they're doing that. The people on the ground are doing that. Now I think the regional community has to come together. If everybody continues as if it's business as usual, I think that we may end up seeing more extremism coming out of Mozambique, because young people with no opportunities who feel like their elections were stolen from them, they become radicals. They become radicals. And already we've seen that the extremist groups operating in Mozambique. It's something that requires intervention, I think, from the region. Something that requires mediation. The best case scenario, if it were up to me, I would push for fresh elections in Mozambique. I would even threaten to impose sanctions and close the borders, even as South Africa and all of these other. The other problem is that the chairperson of the SADC right now is Emerson Mnangagwa, and he's been saying, let's respect sovereignty, or etc., meaning that he's lending his support to Daniel Chapo. Other concern is that Fikile Mbalula is good friends with these people. So I don't know whether South Africa will take such a stand. But that's where things are. I don't know. What do you think about the crisis in Mozambique? Have you been following it? What do you think needs to be done? Let's have a conversation. Till the next one.